Getting your opponent in the pin is one thing, but then what do? There's three main ways to take advantage of a pin. The first one is to put pressure on the pin, or to attack it again. As you can see from this illustration, this poor bishop is stuck there and it can't move away. It wants to move, but it can't. So it's like a sitting duck, and the pawn can push up and put more pressure on it, and it's lost. The second way to take advantage of a pin piece is to capture a piece that it's usually protecting. And the third way is to move to a key square that pin piece is usually protecting. Now we're talking about usually absolute pins in most of these cases, where you're pinning that piece to the king, not a relative pin, because sometimes they'll just jump right out of it and let you capture the piece behind. But that's the subject for another video. Let's go ahead and get started and see Magnus Carlsen, the world's champion, in action. This position is from February 2021, and Magnus Carlsen is white against Grandmaster Daniel Dubov. He sets a nice little trap here. Magnus plays rook to e1 with pressure on that knight and the e-pawn back behind it. Dubov thinks, I move the knight, you capture the pawn on e6 check. It's not very good for me, but hey, at least I can capture this pawn. But that was the trap, because now the knight, by capturing the pawn, is suddenly pinned. And it's pinned to the queen, and instead of going ahead and taking the pawn on e6, Magnus focuses on the newly pinned knight and plays rook to d1. And the knight is toast. It's gone. Dubov resigned. Now, many years earlier, Grandmaster and world champion Garry Kasparov was playing black in this game against Jerome Paquet. And here he moves his queen up, leaving his knight hanging. If the pawn takes, of course, the pawn will capture it back, and that will put pressure on the rook. But white plays here. After Kasparov captures, now Kasparov finds a really clever way to put pressure on this rook on f2. He plays knight to h1, and Paquet resigns. So great move to put pressure on that rook. Of course, if the king takes the knight, then the rook is unprotected. But the main way that we're going to put pressure on a pin piece is with a pawn. Usually you're going to look for a way to put pressure on that pin piece with a pawn. Here, of course, capturing the pawn would take your bishop. You lost 3 points after gaining 5, so you really only gained 2. But instead, if you push the pawn, that rook's not going anywhere. It's a sitting duck, and you get to capture it on the next move and only lose a pawn. Here we see the comparison. You could attack this knight, this pin knight, with your knight, but they castle, and all you gain from that was a pawn. Instead, attack it with a pawn, and now when you capture it next turn, you're only losing a pawn for the knight. But if you don't have a pawn that can attack that pin piece, then you can find something else. Here the knight jumps into b5 to pressure the bishop on c7. And in this one, we go over to the second way to take advantage of a pin piece. The knight's pinned, and it looks like it's guarding the bishop, but because of the pin, it's not. You get to capture the bishop for free. Queen takes g6 check. And another example of that same thing, the rook captures the bishop at e7. The queen can't capture back. It's pinned by your queen. And now finally we look at taking advantage of a pin piece by moving to a key square that the piece looks like it's protecting. The knight appears to be protecting f5, but because of the pin, we can just move our queen in there, forking the king and the rook, and winning the game. At least we hope so. Here we have a pin against a g-pawn. The knight jumps in, taking advantage of that pin pawn to fork black's king and rook again. And I like this example because we are going to take advantage of a pin 2 different ways. First, we get a fork, and now, when this knight moves, we have a pin along the back rank, and we bring more pressure to it and create a battery along that back rank. And here's another example of a battery on a file. Your queen is pinning the knight to the queen, and so you bring your rook over, and that makes a battery and puts more pressure on that pinned knight at the same time. In this example, we're going to unveil the power of this fianchetto bishop along that long diagonal. And simultaneously, at the same time, we're going to put pressure on our target, the knight at c6. So we're putting the pressure and pinning it all with one move. And finally, we look at Morphy against the Duke and the Count from 1858. He has this pin against that rook, and he puts more pressure on it, but not with his queen. His queen's more valuable, and she's already in the action. So he brings his rook over to put the pressure on that rook on d7, and the knight's not really helping out because it's in a pin by the bishop. So the queen steps out of that pin, freeing the knight, but now another pin. This one is the rook from d1 pinning the knight to the checkmate square. And Morphy deflects that knight. He gets it to move away, check. When the knight captures, the rook comes in for the checkmate. All right, that's exploiting pins, and I'll check you later.